Hello, my friend. Welcome to the Sleepy Archive. I'm so glad you're here. How was your day today? Before your eyes get too heavy, a little like and subscribe goes a long way. Sweet dreams. Tonight, the place where history becomes a lullaby and the past becomes a gentle companion as you drift towards sleep. Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle. Let the tension in your shoulders release. Let your breathing slow. And simply listen. Tonight we're going somewhere very old and very beautiful. We're going to France, but not the France of today. Not the busy roads and the bright cafes and the summer tourists. We're going to a much older France. A France of stone and shadow, of monks rising before dawn to sing their prayers in cold, unheated chapels, of kings kneeling in the mud to lay the first stone of a cathedral, knowing they would never live to see it finished, of ordinary people, farmers and barrel makers and stonemasons and glassworkers, men and women with rough hands and simple lives, who built something so extraordinary, so impossibly beautiful, that even now, 8 centuries later, we cannot fully explain how they did it. This is the story of how France built her cathedrals, and it was written down by a woman named Elizabeth Boyle O'Reilly, who spent years traveling through France, touching the cold limestone walls of old churches, reading documents in quiet archives, learning the names of builders and bishops and abbots who have been forgotten for 700 years. She published her book in 1921, and it begins with a question that sounds simple, but is not. Why do human beings build beautiful things? And why, when they stop caring, do they destroy them tonight? You do not need to follow every argument. You do not need to remember every name. All you have to do is let the words float over you, like the slow turning of centuries, like the soft sound of wind moving through a cathedral on a winter afternoon. Let the images come if they wish to, and let them go again. A cathedral rising slowly above a medieval city, the smell of fresh mortar and limestone dust in the air, the sound of a hammer, very faint, very far above the ground, where a mason is setting a stone into a vault, and the cold pale light of a winter morning, coming through an unfinished window where the glass has not yet been placed. This is a book about stone and faith and memory. And it is also, very gently, a book about you and about everyone who came before you and left something beautiful behind. The book begins with a passage from John Ruskin, one of the great writers about art and architecture in the 19th century. And the words are so quiet and so true that they are worth sitting with for a moment. Ruskin wrote, "We may live without architecture and worship without her, but we cannot remember without her." He said there are only 2 strong conquerors of the human tendency to forget, and those 2 things are poetry and architecture. And architecture is the mightier of the 2, because it is not only what men thought and felt, but what their hands actually handled, what their strength actually built, what their eyes actually saw. All the days of their lives, Elizabeth O'Reilly takes this idea and holds it tenderly. Architecture is the living voice of the past. She writes, by architecture, by these stones and vaults and arches, the people who came before us tell us who they were. They wrote it down on great pages of perennial beauty. If only we would stop long enough to read. There is something almost unbearably moving about that idea when you let it settle in. These buildings are not just beautiful objects. They're conversations. They're messages sent across 8 or 9 or 10 centuries from people who are gone to people like us who are still here trying to understand what life is for. And the message the French cathedrals seem to carry, when you walk into one and tilt your head back and look up at the vaulted ceiling above you, rising and rising into dim stone shadow, is something like this. We were here, we suffered, we argued and we sinned and we made war on each other. And yet, in spite of all of that, we built this together. O'Reilly tells us that whenever men have decided to forget this solidarity, this deep connection to the generations before them, their first act has been to destroy cathedrals. In 1914, the German bombardment of Reims Cathedral sent that great building into flames. In 1793, during the Revolution, Cluny was torn down, the greatest Romanesque church in the world, reduced to rubble because someone decided it stood for the wrong things. In 1562, the Cathedral of Orleans was destroyed by Calvinist forces who believed they were reforming what was corrupt and instead simply broke what was beautiful. O'Reilly does not say these things with bitterness. She says them with a kind of quiet grief, as if she is a doctor noting the symptoms of a recurring illness. The illness is forgetting. The cure is memory. And architecture, she says softly, is how we remember. How then do we prevent it from happening again? By making the monuments of the past loved, says Elizabeth O'Reilly, by telling the story of their building, by giving names to the men who built them. If we know them, we will surely revere them. And when we have learned to know and to love, we have learned to be generous. This is what archaeology is for. She says, to teach us to remember. And then she says something that surprised me when I first read it. She says that the cathedrals of France are not just the property of Catholics or even of Christians. She says that whether you worship in a cathedral or a mosque or a synagogue or under the open sky, whether you read Karl Marx or Thomas Aquinas, you were robbed of your inheritance when those buildings were destroyed, because those buildings belong to everyone, to the whole long human story, not to any single faction or creed. It is the year 1200 and something. Let that settle in your mind for a moment. The year 1200 and something. The world has no electricity, no printing press, no glass in most windows, no reliable roads. The average person will never travel more than 30 miles from the village where they were born. They work from before sunrise to after dark. They are frequently hungry. They are often sick. They live, if they're lucky, perhaps 40 years. And yet, in city after city across France, in Chartres and Amiens and Reims and Paris and Bourges and Lyon, these people are building structures of such impossible lightness and height that the architects who design skyscrapers today still marvel at them. They are building walls made almost entirely of colored glass. They are carving stone so delicate it looks like lace. They are raising vaults and towers without the help of any machinery that we would recognize. Only ropes and pulleys and wooden scaffolding and the accumulated skill of generations. O'Reilly asks why they did it, and her answer is not simple. It was not just faith. Though faith was certainly there, it was not just civic pride, though that played a role too. It was something she finds harder to name, something like an aspiration, a reaching upward, both physical and spiritual at once, a desire to make something worthy of what they believe the world could be. And the strange and wonderful thing, she says, is that they succeeded. France in the 12th and 13th centuries, says Elizabeth O'Reilly, was the most important nation in the world. She says this calmly and without jingoism, as a simple observation of historical fact. And she is not alone in saying it. She quotes John Ruskin, who told an audience in Edinburgh in 1853, long before medieval archaeology was a proper science, that the French nation in the 12th and 13th centuries was the greatest nation in the world, and that the French not only invented Gothic architecture, but carried it to its noblest developments. The French Gothic churches, O'Reilly explains, are a fountainhead, a source from which all the great Gothic architecture of Europe flows. Because of them we have Westminster Abbey and Ely Cathedral and Lincoln Cathedral. Because of them we have the great cathedrals of Burgos and Toledo and Leon and Seville in Spain. Because of the French cathedrals we have Cologne and Magdeburg in Germany, and eventually Florence and Siena in Italy, and Uppsala in Sweden and Prague in Bohemia. France in those 2 centuries was also the center of European intellectual life. The University of Paris drew students from every country, 30,000 of them at its height. Young men sitting on the rushes of cold lecture rooms, debating philosophy and theology with the same intensity that young people today argue about politics and science. The literature of France, the epic poems and the love lyrics and the romances spread across the continent and shaped the imagination of Europe. And then there is this small detail, which O'Reilly slips in quietly, almost as an afterthought. In the year 1181, a cloth merchant from the city of Assisi was traveling in France on business. He had seen the Cathedral of Lyons being built, perhaps also the Cathedral of Paris or of Poitiers. He had passed under the great sculpted doorways of Burgundy and the Midi, full of carved figures and stories in stone. And he was so moved by what he had seen, so filled with something he could not quite name, that when he returned home to Assisi and his wife gave birth to a son, he named the child Francis, in memory of beautiful France. The boy grew up to love the songs of France and called himself God's little troubadour, and became Saint Francis of Assisi. One of the most beloved figures in the history of Christianity, the cathedrals of France reach further than stone and mortar. They reach all the way into the lives of saints and poets, into the imagination of a whole civilization. But who built these cathedrals? Who were they really? O'Reilly wants us to feel the answer in our bones, not just know in our heads. So she reminds us of something that modern people tend to forget. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the countries and borders we think of as permanent were not yet what they are today. England and France were not yet clearly separated nations. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 had created a world where English kings spoke French and French bishops governed English dioceses. The families of England and France were intertwined by blood and marriage and land. When she looks at the list of people who came into France from other countries to help build her cathedrals and her monasteries, the list is extraordinary. From Ireland came Saint Columbanus, who founded monasteries in Burgundy in the 7th century. From England came Alcuin the scholar, who ran the school at the Abbey of St. Martin in Tours, and Stephen Harding, who co-founded the Cistercian order and welcomed St. Bernard de Citeaux, and Stephen Langton, who divided the Bible into chapters while living in peaceful exile at Pontigny, and Thomas Becket, who spent years sheltered at Sens Cathedral while in conflict with the English king. From Germany came Saint Radegund and the theologian Norbert. From Italy came Benedict and Lanfranc and Anselm, who transformed the Abbey of Bec in Normandy into one of the finest intellectual centers in Europe. From Spain came Saint Dominic, who began his great preaching order. From Portugal came Saint Anthony of Padua. They all came to France, and they all left something of themselves in the churches that still stand there today. O'Reilly says something else too, something that is addressed personally to those of us who come from England or Ireland or Scotland or anywhere in the English-speaking world. She points out that in the 12th century, many of our own ancestors, the very people whose names we carry, came from France. The great wave of Norman settlers who arrived in England and Ireland after 1066 brought with them the same building traditions and the same artistic instincts that were shaping the cathedrals of the Isle de France. The very names we bear, she says quietly, are those of the cathedral builders. Now let us turn to the first chapter of Elizabeth O'Reilly's book, where she asks the fundamental question that everything else depends on. What is Gothic architecture? The name Gothic is itself a strange and somewhat misleading word. It was originally a term of contempt, introduced by the artists of the Italian Renaissance in the 15th and 16th centuries, who looked at the great French and German cathedrals and dismissed them as barbaric, the work of Goths, rough invaders, who had helped bring down the Roman Empire. The word was meant as an insult, and it stuck. It is one of history's more entertaining ironies that the most sophisticated and scientifically accomplished architecture the world has ever produced should have been named after barbarians by people who misunderstood it. But before we can understand Gothic, we need to understand what came before it. The architecture that preceded Gothic in France is called Romanesque, which simply means descended from Rome, and it dominated France from roughly the year 1000 to the middle of the 12th century, the year 1000. Let that year float in your mind for a moment. 1,000 years after the birth of Christ. The world that was building Romanesque churches was a world still barely recovering from centuries of violence and disruption. The Roman Empire had fallen. Wave after wave of invading peoples had swept through France. Visigoths and Huns and Vandals and Saracens from the south, and then the most feared of all, the Norsemen from Scandinavia, who came by sea and by river and burned and plundered from the northern coasts all the way to Poitiers and Clermont. Charlemagne's brief revival of civilization had collapsed after his death. The roads were unsafe, trade had nearly stopped. Learning had retreated into the monasteries where monks copied manuscripts by candlelight and kept the flame alive. A chronicler named Flodord wrote, "Look, where you will, the sky is red with fires," and then, slowly, something changed, not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually. As the worst of the invasion subsided, and a new royal dynasty in France began to impose some order on the chaos, and the bishops formulated the Truce of God, which forced the violent lords to keep peace from Wednesday night to Monday morning. A small thing, but it was something. Intervals of peace, in which commerce could slowly revive, in which craftsmen could practice their skills, in which bishops could begin to dream of rebuilding their ruined churches in stone. The monk Raoul Glaber, writing in the early 11th century, described what he saw happening around him, and his description is one of the most beautiful passages in medieval literature. He said it was as if the whole earth, as if by one accord, was throwing off its tatters of old age and reclothing itself in a white mantle of churches. A white mantle of churches. That image has stayed with scholars and poets for 1,000 years. The idea of all those stone buildings rising up, at once across the land, like flowers blooming after a long winter. The sound of hammers and the smell of mortar drifting over the fields of France in the bright cold air of the early 11th century. The monastery where Raoul Glaber lived, Saint Benign at Dijon, was one of the first to build anew, and its crypt dates from the year 1001, a date close enough to the millennium that you can almost feel the relief in the stone. We are still here. The world did not end. We are going to build something permanent and beautiful. At Chartres, Bishop Fulbert undertook to rebuild his cathedral after a fire in the year 1020, and the vast crypt he dug beneath it still exists today, astonishing every visitor who descends into it. A cathedral under a cathedral, full of dim light and old stone and silence. But what were these early builders actually trying to solve? What was the problem that occupied all their energy and ingenuity for over a century, until it was finally solved in the middle of the 12th century in a way that changed everything? The problem was the roof, a wooden roof. O'Reilly explains, is an easy prey for fire. And the Middle Ages knew this better than any other age because they had watched so many of their churches burn. The great churches of the Carolingian era, of Charlemagne's time, had burned. The churches built after them had burned. Everything burned. Candles and cooking fires and lightning and the torches of raiders. Everything eventually caught and everything burned. And so the builders of the Romanesque era set themselves one enormous task: how to build a stone roof over a wide space without making the walls so thick and heavy that the building became a dark and oppressive cave. This sounds like a simple engineering problem, but it is not. It is one of the most difficult structural challenges in the history of architecture, and the answer, when it finally came, would be so elegant and so efficient that it would seem almost like a discovery rather than an invention, as if it had been waiting in the laws of physics all along, for someone patient and clever enough to find it. The churches of Western Europe in these centuries followed a plan inherited from ancient Rome, a plan called the basilica, a long oblong hall, with a nave running down the center, flanked by lower side aisles separated from the nave by rows of columns or piers, and a rounded apse at the eastern end where the altar stood. Over the centuries, as the Catholic liturgy developed and became more elaborate, the basilica plan was modified and enriched. A porch was added at the western entrance for those not yet baptized. Galleries were built above the side aisles for the overflow of congregations. The choir was lengthened and raised above the main floor to accommodate the clergy who sang the daily services. A transept was inserted, a crosswise nave that gave the building the shape of a cross, which the theological writers of the 13th century would later interpret as a symbol of the crucified Christ, though O'Reilly notes gently that the symbolism came after the fact. The builders added the transept because it was useful. The theologians found the meaning in it afterward, which is perhaps how meaning often works. And then there was the ambulatory, a curving corridor running around the outside of the apse behind the high altar, so that pilgrims who came to venerate relics could walk around the sacred space without disrupting the services of the monks and the choir. In time, the ambulatory sprouted little chapels opening off it, radiating outward from the curved apse like petals from the center of a flower. And these too were given symbolic meanings: the crown of thorns, the rays of divine light. It is worth pausing here to imagine this space, this ambulatory behind the high altar of a great medieval cathedral. You are a pilgrim. It is very early in the morning, before the sun has risen over the city outside. You have walked perhaps many miles to get here. Your feet are sore. Your coat is damp with morning mist. You push open a small door in the side of the cathedral and enter the ambulatory, and all around you, in the little chapels, candles are burning on 100 altars, and the light from those candles moves through colored glass windows, turning the stone of the floor to red and blue and gold. And somewhere ahead of you in the darkness, behind a carved screen, the monks are singing the morning office, their voices rising into the high vaulted space above. And you stand still, and the weariness of your journey falls away. And for a moment, for just a moment, you understand why they built this. The great problem of Romanesque architecture, the problem the builders wrestled with for over a century, was the barrel vault. A barrel vault is the simplest form of stone roof. Imagine a long tunnel of curved stone stretching over the length of a nave, and you have a barrel vault. The Romans had used barrel vaults, and the early medieval builders knew how to construct them. But there was a serious difficulty. A barrel vault exerts an enormous outward push along its entire length. It presses outward against the walls that support it, constantly, relentlessly, never resting. And to resist that push, to keep the walls from being slowly forced apart by the weight of the stone above, the walls had to be enormously thick, and thick walls mean small windows. because every window is a hole in the wall, and every hole weakens the wall's resistance to the vault above. So the churches of the early Romanesque period were dark, beautiful in their own way, with their round arches and heavy carved columns and dim interior spaces where the light moved slowly through small round-headed windows, but dark, weighted with stone, pressing down on the spirit rather than lifting it. The builders did not accept this darkness passively. They tried again and again to find a way to make their churches lighter. They tried different shapes of vault, different arrangements of supports, different ways of distributing the enormous weight of the stone ceiling, and each failed attempt was a lesson. Each collapsing wall, each vault that cracked and had to be rebuilt, each abbey church that was reconstructed 3 times and 4 times in the same century, was adding to collective understanding, a slowly growing knowledge shared not just by one builder in one place, but by an entire generation of craftsmen across France who talked to each other and traveled and observed what their colleagues were doing, and slowly, patiently, built up the knowledge that would eventually become Gothic architecture. The Abbey Church of Bec in Normandy, one of the most important in 11th century France, was finished, then reconstructed again, and then reconstructed a 3rd time. No failure could discourage those old builders. O'Reilly says this with evident admiration. Already inherent in this newly forming nation was the creative genius of France. Perseverance and courage were to have their reward through all those difficult centuries, from the worst of the Norse invasions to the slow beginnings of recovery. One institution more than any other kept the light of learning and art alive in France, and that institution was the great Benedictine monastery of Cluny. Cluny was founded in the year 910, in Burgundy, in the darkest years of the Middle Ages, and it grew into something that had perhaps never existed before in the history of European civilization, a network of monasteries, eventually numbering in the thousands, spread across every country of Europe, all under the authority of the Abbot of Cluny, all following the same rule of life, all sharing the same commitment to learning and craftsmanship and the art of building. The Abbot of Cluny in the second half of the 11th century was a man named Hugues, St. Hugues, who ruled the monastery for 60 years, from 1049 to 1109, and during those 60 years, he trained the leaders who would remake European civilization. Gregory VII, the great reforming pope, had passed through Cluny's discipline. Urban II, who preached the First Crusade in 1095, had been a monk in that great Burgundian house. It was an era when the purity of religious life and the expansion of art moved together, feeding each other. O'Reilly observes, as if the cleaning of faith releases creative energy that had been locked up and waiting, St. Benedict had taught his monks that work, as well as prayer, was part of salvation, and the monks of Cluny took this teaching seriously. They were farmers, and they turned the land around their monasteries into model farms, removing the stigma that manual labor was only fit for serfs. They were craftsmen of every kind. Their schools taught music and metalwork and illumination and stone cutting. They were travelers, moving in bands of 12 along the roads of France and Spain and Germany and Italy, singing as they went, carrying their skills with them into every place they settled. And above all, the art of arts at Cluny was the builder's art, the art that takes all other arts into its service and leads them to the glorification of God's house. When monks from Cluny set out to colonize new territories, they brought their tools as well as their books, their measuring lines as well as their psalters. And though there was no distinct Cluny style of architecture, no single look that marked a Cluniac church from a distance, the spirit of Cluny, patient, skilled, tireless, was everywhere in the buildings that rose across France in those hopeful centuries after the year 1000. By the end of the 11th century, France had divided into distinct regional schools of architecture, each with its own character, shaped by the local stone, the local climate, the local traditions, and the particular problems each region had tried to solve. In Normandy, the architecture was bold and severe, massive rounded piers, clean geometric forms, a sober grandeur that came partly from the character of the Normans themselves, practical and ambitious and slightly austere. The abbey churches of Caen, built by William the Conqueror and his wife Matilda in the 1060s, are perhaps the purest expression of this spirit, all strength and clarity, with little of the decorative richness you find further south. In Burgundy, the great mother house of Cluny had its influence, and the Burgundian churches were distinguished by their height and their elaboration. Cluny itself, before the Revolution destroyed it, was the largest Romanesque church in the world. Its nave stretching over 180 meters, a building so vast and so serene that contemporaries compared entering it to passing into the antechamber of heaven, in Auvergne, in the volcanic heart of France. The churches are built from the dark lava stone of the region, giving them a somber grandeur quite unlike anything elsewhere. Notre Dame du Port at Clermont-Ferrand is the classic type, small and perfectly proportioned, with a nave that seems to breathe with a slow, geological patience, as if it partook of the nature of the ancient mountains around it. In Poitou, in the west, the Romanesque churches are known for their facades, great screens of carved stone, every surface covered with sculpture and ornament, figures of saints and horsemen and fantastical beasts arranged in a formal geometry of arches and columns, giving even a modest village church the richness of a reliquary. In Languedoc in the south, and in Provence, the influence of Rome itself is felt. Roman remains were everywhere, columns and arches and carved stones still standing in the fields and embedded in the walls of later buildings, and the architects of those regions absorbed the classical tradition with an ease that their northern colleagues never quite achieved. The cloister of St. Trophime at Arles is almost Roman in its clarity and calm. And then came the idea that changed everything. The theory long taught in the great scholarly institutions of France was that somewhere in the royal domain, the Isle de France, in the first decades of the 11th century, or perhaps a little later, some obscure mason under some groined vault, perhaps watching it begin to sag and crack, began to reinforce it with stone ribs crossing diagonally from corner to corner, the intersecting rib. It sounds like such a small thing, too. Arches of stone crossing each other in an X over the rectangular space of a vault bay. But from that small thing, every great Gothic cathedral in the world eventually grew. O'Reilly explains the structural principle slowly and carefully, because once you understand it, you understand everything about why Gothic cathedrals look the way they do, why they are so tall and so light and so full of glass. The intersecting diagonal ribs gathered all the weight and thrust of the stone vault, and concentrated it at four specific points, the four corners of each vault bay, where the ribs met the tops of the piers below, instead of the vault's weight pressing outward along the entire length of the wall. It now pressed downward and outward only at those four precise points, which meant that only those points needed to be reinforced. The walls in between could be thinned, or removed entirely, and replaced with glass. This was the moment of liberation, the moment when the Gothic cathedral became possible. The wall was no longer a load-bearing necessity. It was a screen, a membrane between inside and outside, and that membrane could be made of colored glass without the building falling down. You could hang light inside a stone structure. You could build a lantern 100 feet high. You could make a building that seemed, from inside, to be made not of stone but of air and colored fire. The key word here is thrust and counter-thrust. O'Reilly returns to it again and again. Gothic architecture is the art of erecting buildings with vaults whose ribs intersect, and whose thrusts are stopped by buttresses. The vault pushes outward, the buttress pushes back, and between those two balance forces, the building stands, not because it is massive, but because it is alive, because its forces are in motion, balance against each other, like a dancer holding a pose. If the vault pushes outward at 4 points, the buttress must meet it at those same 4 points, and meet it with exactly the right amount of force, not too little, which would let the wall lean and eventually fall, and not too much, which would push the wall inward and cause a different kind of collapse. The first builders who understood the diagonal rib were working this out through experience, through trial and much error. The first flying buttresses, those elegant arching, supports that reach over the side aisles to prop up the upper walls of the nave, were hidden at first under the lean-to roofs of the tribune galleries, because the builders were not yet confident enough in them to let them be seen. Slowly, as the principle was understood more deeply, the flying buttresses moved into the open air, became not embarrassments but ornaments, became one of the most distinctive and beautiful features of the Gothic cathedral style, crowning the exterior with an intricate forest of arches and pinnacles that looks almost like a second building growing out of the first. And the pinnacles, those small pointed towers that crown the buttresses and seem to be purely decorative, are not decorative at all. They have a specific structural function. By adding weight to the top of the buttress, they help channel the transmitted force of the vault downward through the buttress into the ground. Every beauty in a Gothic cathedral, says O'Reilly, has a structural explanation. Nothing is there for mere show. The soaring height is there because the diagonal ribs made height achievable. The slender columns are there because the ribs collect the load so that only those thin shafts of stone need bear it. The great windows are there because the walls between the active members can be replaced with glass. The pinnacles are there because they help the buttresses do their work. Everything is honest. Everything is true. And perhaps that is part of why Gothic cathedrals have the spiritual quality they have. There is no pretense in them. What you see is exactly what holds the building up. O'Reilly quotes a medieval era proverb, "An arch never sleeps," and the medieval architect, hearing that thought, "Then let us set a guard on it that also never sleeps." And from that thought, he built the flying buttress, and from the flying buttress, in time, came Amiens and Chartres and Reims and all the rest. Chapter 2 of Elizabeth O'Reilly's book opens at the center of everything, at the place where the theory finally became reality, at the Abbey of St. Denis, just north of Paris, where in the years between 1140 and 1144, a remarkable man named Suger built the first truly Gothic monument of significant size. Suger was the abbot of St. Denis, and calling him simply an abbot is like calling Shakespeare simply a playwright. He was one of those rare people who seem to have been made for their moment, who understand their historical situation so clearly, and who act so decisively within it that history bends around them. He was born around 1081, the son of peasants, which in the 12th century meant he would normally have had no prospects at all. But as a small boy, he was given to the Abbey of St. Denis as an oblate, a child offered to the monastery by his family in the hope that the church would give him opportunities the world could not. And it did. At the Abbey school, he studied alongside a boy who would become Louis VI, King of France, and the friendship they formed as schoolboys would last their lifetimes and shape the history of their country. Suger was small in stature. People who wrote about him noted this with affectionate frequency, but he had enormous energy and what O'Reilly calls a genius for organization. He reformed the finances of his monastery. He negotiated treaties between the king and his restless barons. When Louis VII went on crusade, he left Suger as regent of France, and Suger governed the kingdom with such wisdom and such care that when the king returned, he called him the father of the fatherland. But Suger's greatest work, the work for which all of this was preparation, was the rebuilding of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis. Saint Denis himself was the patron saint of France, the missionary who had brought Christianity to Paris in the 3rd century, and who had been martyred there, beheaded on what is now called Montmartre, the Hill of Martyrs. The abbey built over his tomb was the most important church in France, the burial place of the kings, the spiritual heart of the nation, and by Suger's time it had become dangerously overcrowded. Pilgrims were being crushed to death on festival days, and the building itself was inadequate in every way for the dignity of its role. Suger decided to rebuild it, and in rebuilding it, to demonstrate, definitively, what Gothic architecture could do. Suger himself left us an account of how he built his abbey church, a document that is one of the treasures of medieval literature, full of practical details and moments of almost childlike excitement about the beauty of what was being created. He tells us how he worried about finding timber for the roof, how he lay awake at night over the problem, then rose before dawn, went into the forest himself, and by 9 in the morning had found a tree large enough. By noon he had found 10 more, and they were hauled in triumph back to the abbey. He tells us how the people came voluntarily, in pious enthusiasm, harnessing themselves to the carts to drag the great blocks of stone from the quarries at Pontoise, men and women and children pulling together in long lines, singing as they went, the canticles of the liturgy becoming work songs, and the work songs becoming prayers. He describes the windows he made for the new choir, and his words are so full of wonder at the light they created that they are worth pausing on. He tells us how many-colored light, falling through the jeweled glass, lifted his soul from the cares of this world to divine meditation, that this art, which he had grasped as profoundly in its spiritual appeal as in its structural logic, was most aptly fashioned to be a foretaste of something beyond this world, neither quite of earth, nor yet of heaven. The popular imagination seized on the deep blue of those Saint Denis windows, and invented a legend that Suger had ground down sapphires to obtain that color. The truth is that the technique has been entirely lost. Generations of later craftsmen tried to recreate it and failed. 7 centuries of scholarship have not unlocked the secret of that particular blue, and there is something fitting about that. Something that was made in faith and hope and joy simply cannot be reproduced by technical analysis alone. It requires the original spirit, and the original spirit is gone now, living only in the fragments of old glass that remain, and in the light that still falls through them on certain winter mornings when the sun is low and the cathedral is quiet and the tourists have not yet arrived. On the 11th of June in the year 1144, the new choir of Saint Denis was dedicated, in a gathering of bishops and barons that included most of the important men in France. King Louis VII was there. Suger had made the moment a national ceremony, a demonstration of what the new architecture could achieve, and the important men of France went back to their cities carrying the lesson with them. Each one went home and looked at his own cathedral and began to imagine what it could become. One of the first great cathedrals to follow the example of Saint Denis was the Cathedral of Noyon, and Noyon holds a distinction that deserves a moment of quiet attention. Of all the Gothic cathedrals of France, Noyon was the first to be begun, built around the year 1150, just a few years after the dedication of Suger's choir. And not only was Noyon first in Gothic architecture, it was also the city where, in the year 1109, the Bishop Baron had granted his city a communal charter, first written municipal laws of known date in all of France. O'Reilly notes this connection without forcing it. She simply sets the two facts side by side and lets them speak. in 1109, the first communal charter in France, in 1150, the first Gothic cathedral, both happening in the same small city on the plains of Picardy. There's perhaps something in that coincidence, something about a society that is beginning to define itself more precisely, to write itself down, that finds expression both in law and in architecture at the same moment. The Cathedral of Noyon was later badly damaged in the First World War by the same German bombardment that sent shells into Reims Cathedral. But when O'Reilly was writing in 1921, she could still describe it with the particular affection it inspired. Its nave was, she wrote, a vessel of most perfect proportion, and it had something unusual among French cathedrals. Its transept ended at both north and south and around it. Apse, like a set of half domes, rather than the flat or pointed ends more commonly seen, giving the interior an unusual completeness, a feeling that every direction was rounded and contained, that there was no sharp edge or abrupt termination, only gentle curves leading the eye from surface to surface and finally upward into the vault above. Close to Noyon was another early cathedral, the Cathedral of Senlis, begun perhaps around 1153, which means that two of the three or four earliest Gothic cathedrals in France were within a day's ride of each other, in the same rolling countryside north of Paris, in the same flat open landscape where the wheat fields stretch to the horizon and the sky feels very large and very near. The Tower of Senlis was called, in the old phrase, the pride of the Valois land, and O'Reilly lingers over it with quiet pleasure. Let us now journey south from Noyon and Senlis, past Paris, to the city of Sens, where another early Gothic cathedral was being built around the year 1160, and where a remarkable meeting of history and architecture took place. Sens was an ancient see, governed in the 12th century by a succession of notable men. And it was here, in this cathedral still rising from its foundations, that Thomas Becket came in exile. Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had defied the English King Henry II on the question of whether priests should be tried in royal courts or only in church courts, who had fled England for his life in 1164, and who found refuge in France, in the cathedral city of Sens, where he lived for 2 years under the protection of the French king and the Bishop of Sens, studying and praying and waiting for the political winds to shift. 6 years later, in 1170, Becket was allowed to return to England, and within a few weeks of his return, for knights who believed they were acting on the king's wishes entered Canterbury Cathedral and murdered him at the altar. The shockwave that passed through Christendom at this news was enormous. Within a few years, Becket had been canonized. His tomb at Canterbury became one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in Europe. And his story, the story of a man who had died for the principle that the church must be free, was told in windows and sculpture and illuminated manuscripts across the whole of the Christian world. In France, which had sheltered him in his exile, there was a particular tenderness for his memory, and many French cathedrals have windows dedicated to his story, some of the most beautiful, depicting the life and martyrdom of the saint, are in the Cathedral of Sens itself, the city where he had lived and prayed and waited. The glass of Sens is one of the glories of the Middle Ages, windows of a quality so exceptional that O'Reilly describes them simply as the glory of Sens, not far from Sens. In date, if not in geography, was the Cathedral of Leon, begun also around 1160, and Leon has a particular magic that makes it unlike any other Gothic cathedral in France. It sits high on a rocky hill above the surrounding plain, its towers visible from many miles away, and on those towers, on the corner turrets of the two great western towers, are carved stone oxen. The oxen of Leon, These carved stone oxen on the cathedral towers are one of those details of medieval art that seem at first almost inexplicable, and then, when you know the story, seem completely inevitable. The legend says that they were placed there in memory of the oxen who labored to haul the stones for the cathedral up the steep hill from the plain below, that the people of Leon, in gratitude for the work of those animals, honored them in stone on the towers of the building there. Labor had made possible. Whether the legend is literally true is perhaps less important than what it tells us about the spirit in which the cathedral was built. A spirit that noticed the suffering of animals, that found beauty worth honoring in simple hard work, that understood that the great and the humble were all part of the same effort. Leon was the seat of a famous school in the 12th century, the school of Anselm of Leon, one of the most important teachers of his generation, and young men came from all over Europe to study there, including a young man from Brittany named Pierre Abelard, who would become the most brilliant and the most controversial thinker of his century, and whose troubled love story with Heloise would become one of the great romantic tragedies of the Middle Ages. The intellectual atmosphere of Leon, the sense of serious argument and deep inquiry, found its way, O'Reilly suggests, into the architecture of the cathedral itself, which has a severity and a discipline about it, a feeling of thought made concrete, that distinguishes it from the more lyrical cathedrals of the West. And then there is Soissons, begun a little later than Leon, and O'Reilly pauses on Soissons with particular care, because when she was writing in 1921, Soissons had just been almost destroyed by the First World War, and the desolation of the city around the cathedral gave an added poignancy to what she found in the southern arm of the transept, which had been built around 1180, and which she calls simply the most exquisite thing in France, a hemicycle, a curving apse end, of such perfect proportion and such quiet beauty that no description quite does it justice. One of those things that can only be experienced in silence, in the fading afternoon light of a late autumn day, when the city outside is still, and the old stones seem to be remembering something. Let us come now to the cathedral above all cathedrals, the one that for most people, when they think of Gothic architecture, comes first to mind, Notre Dame de Paris, Our Lady of Paris, begun in the year 1163 on an island in the River Seine in the middle of what was then the fastest growing city in the Western world. Paris in 1163 was extraordinary. It was the intellectual capital of Europe. Students from every country crowded into its schools, 30,000 of them, an astonishing number for the 12th century, sitting on the rushes of cold lecture rooms, debating questions of philosophy and theology with an intensity that surprised even their teachers. The city was growing so rapidly that it kept spilling over its old boundaries. New buildings rising on both banks of the river, new bridges crossing it, new markets and churches and schools appearing every decade. The bishop who decided to build Notre Dame was Maurice de Sully, and he was one of those medieval bishops who seems in hindsight to have been exactly the right man in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. He was scholarly and capable and entirely sincere in his faith, and O'Reilly notes with her characteristic precision that while he was building Notre Dame Cathedral, he was also building 4 monasteries, in one of which he asked to be buried when he died. There was no conflict in his mind between the great public project and the quiet private devotion. They were the same thing expressed at different scales. The west facade of Notre Dame, its 2 great towers and its 3 deep car portals and its gallery of kings, is perhaps the most famous facade in the world. O'Reilly calls it, with simple certainty, a classic. She does not mean merely that it is old or famous. She means that it has achieved a kind of perfection in its proportions that places it beyond fashion. a thing that was not made for its own time alone, but for all time. Above the central portal is a great rose window, a wheel of light, 33 feet across, and above that a gallery connecting the two towers, and above that the towers themselves, rising 226 feet above the plaza. There's stone catching the first light of morning long before the city below has woken up. But Notre Dame was not built all at once, and it was not built by one man. It was built across almost 2 centuries by a succession of bishops and architects and craftsmen, each generation inheriting the work of the last and adding to it, and sometimes changing course slightly as taste and technology evolved. The first architect of Notre Dame is unknown. His name has been lost. We know only that he was a man of extraordinary vision, who looked at the island in the sane and imagined something that had never existed before, and then began, stone by stone, to make it real. The transept chapels and the apt chapels were added by a master named Jean de Chelles, and then by his successor Pierre de Chelles, father and son working on the same building a generation apart, which is itself a kind of image of everything the medieval cathedral represents, the handing down of a project too large for any single life, the trust that someone will come after you and continue what you have begun, the faith that the work itself is worth the dedication of generations. And alongside Notre Dame, a few decades later, King Louis IX had the Sainte-Chapelle built within the royal palace on the same island to house the crown of thorns which he had purchased at enormous expense from the Emperor of Constantinople. The Sainte-Chapelle is in some ways the purest expression of what Gothic architecture was trying to achieve. Its walls are almost entirely glass, 15 enormous windows filling every bay from floor to vault, so that standing inside the upper chapel is like standing inside a jewel, with light falling through red and blue and gold glass and patterns of such complexity that the eye can never quite take them all in at once. And the stone of the building itself seems almost to disappear, leaving only light. O'Reilly pauses here to speak of Louis IX, St. Louis, with genuine warmth, as if she had known him personally through the long years of reading about him. He was, she says, the truest lover of the builder's art among all the French kings, a man who illuminated his kingdom with fair churches, who sat under an oak tree in the forest of Vincennes, dispensing personal justice to his subjects, who wore rough cloth next to his skin as a form of penance, and could not be persuaded that this was inappropriate behavior for a king, who was brave in battle and gentle in private life, and who died on crusade in Tunisia in the year 1270, having spent his whole reign trying to make France worthy of the faith it professed to hold. Now we reach the age of the great cathedrals, the mature flowering of Gothic architecture, the decades between roughly 1194 and 1250, when the buildings that are still considered the supreme achievements of the style were built or begun in a remarkable burst of creative energy concentrated in northern France. O'Reilly calls this period simply the era of the great cathedrals, and she treats it with a reverence that is entirely earned. These are Chartres and Reims and Amiens III, buildings so extraordinary that the words available to describe them seem inadequate. The best that writing can do, perhaps, is to give some sense of the human story behind each one, the chain of accidents and intentions and sacrifices that produce them. Chartres Cathedral stands on a low hill above the flat wheat plains of the Beauce, and it has stood there in some form since the 4th century, when the first Christian community was established in the city. A series of earlier churches on the site had burned, the last great fire coming in the year 1194, when lightning struck the cathedral built by Bishop Fulbert in the 11th century and burned it almost entirely to the ground. The people of Chartres watching the fire from the surrounding fields, believe that the most precious relic in their keeping, the tunic said to have been worn by the Virgin Mary at the Annunciation, had been destroyed in the blaze, a relic given to the cathedral by Charlemagne himself, treasured for 3 centuries, gone in a single night of fire and smoke. But 3 days later, the priests emerged from the crypt under the ruins, carrying the reliquary containing the tunic, unharmed, and the people of Chartres, who had fallen into despair, took this as a sign. The Virgin herself had protected her relic. She wished the cathedral to be rebuilt, and rebuilt more magnificently than before. And the money began to flow in from every direction, from the king and the nobles and the guilds of the city, and from pilgrims who came from all over France and beyond. And within 30 years, by the early 1220s, the cathedral we see today was essentially complete. The western facade, with its 3 great portals, which had survived the fire, was joined to a new building behind it of such soaring height and lightness that it seemed almost to deny the weight of its own stone. The stained glass of Chartres, O'Reilly writes, excels all other cathedrals in the wealth and quality of its windows, chiefly from the 12th and 13th centuries, and she is not exaggerating. There are more than 150 windows, covering an area of glass that has no equal anywhere in the world, and the famous Chartres blue, that particular shade of deep blue that seems to contain light rather than merely transmit it, is one of the wonders of medieval craftsmanship. At certain times of day, when the sun is at the right angle and the light is coming through the west windows, the whole interior of the cathedral fills with a blue that seems to have no source. It is simply everywhere, in the air, on the stone floor, on the faces of people who stand looking up at it in silence, not quite able to explain what is happening to them. And then there is Reims, the cathedral of the coronation of the kings of France, begun in 1211 by a bishop named Albert de Humbert, who was a crusader, who had seen the Holy Land and come back changed by it, and who decided to rebuild his cathedral more magnificently than any that had come before. The names of the architects of Reims are known to us, inscribed in elaborate designs set into the pavement of the nave, which was itself a kind of signature, an unusual act of public recognition for craftsmen in an age when most building was anonymous. Jean d'Orbais began it. Jean Leloup continued. Gaucher de Reims after him, and Bernard de Soissons, who completed the nave. For architects, 4 generations, 1 building. The west facade of Reims is considered by many to be the culmination of Gothic art, the point at which everything that had been building for 2 centuries reached its fullest expression. If Chartres is the great mystic cathedral, brooding and luminous, Reims is the great civic cathedral, open and joyful, its facade covered with so many hundreds of carved figures, angels and prophets and kings and saints, that has been called the Cathedral of the Angels. And in 1429, in this building where French kings have been crowned since the time of Clovis, a 17-year-old girl from a peasant village in Lorraine stood beside the Dauphin of France and watched him become King Charles VII, fulfilling the mission she had believed herself called to Joan of Arc, La Pucelle, the Maid of Orleans, who had heard voices and believed them, and because she believed, changed everything. And then there is Amiens, the last of the 3 great cathedrals of the mature Gothic period, begun in 1220, 3 years before Reims was completed, and finished in its essentials within a single human lifetime, which is extraordinary for a building of its scale and ambition. Amiens has been called the Parthenon of Gothic art, a comparison that O'Reilly offers not as mere flattery, but as a precise observation, just as the Parthenon represents the perfect fulfillment of the principles of classical Greek architecture. Amiens represents the perfect fulfillment of the principles of Gothic. Every element is exactly right, exactly sufficient, nothing added for display that is not there for structure, nothing removed for simplicity that would have served a purpose. It is the image of an idea thought all the way through, from the first diagonal rib to its ultimate logical conclusion. A building 144 feet high inside, the tallest Gothic nave in France, and yet not merely tall, but proportioned in a way that makes the height feel not oppressive but liberating, as if the space itself is breathing, expanding upward with a slow and inevitable rightness, like the opening of a flower in time-lapse photography. The sculptor's work at Amiens is the peer of Reims and Chartres, which is to say it is among the finest figure sculpture produced in the Western world. The central figure of the West Portal, Christ as teacher, called Le Beau Dieu, the beautiful God, is one of those works of art about which people who have seen it find it difficult to speak without pausing. It has a quality that is hard to name, not merely technical perfection, though the technical perfection is absolute, but something in the expression, a combination of authority and gentleness, of absolute certainty and absolute compassion, that makes people stand before it in silence for longer than they expected, forgetting for a moment where they are and when they are and what they intended to do next. And there's also at Amiens, somewhat later in date, a figure called the Vierge Dorée, the Golden Virgin, standing on the central pier of the South Transept portal, smiling, with a smile that art historians have been trying to describe accurately for centuries, and have not quite managed. It is a smile that knows something, that has accepted something, and found it both sorrowful and bearable, and perhaps even beautiful. There is a quality that the great Gothic cathedrals of France share, a quality that is difficult to name but immediately felt when you enter one of them. And Elizabeth O'Reilly spends much of her book trying to find words for it. She calls it by different names in different chapters. Aspiration, the reaching toward infinity, the material expression of an immaterial longing. She quotes the Gothic architects themselves, or at least the spirit of their work, which seemed always to be, saying, higher and lighter, and more of the wall should be window, and the piers should be thinner, and the vault should spring from lower, so that the whole interior space is one single upward movement. This quality, this aspiration, is not something that was imposed on the cathedrals from outside. It was not a theological requirement or a royal command. It grew organically from the structural logic of the architecture itself. Each improvement in the understanding of thrust and counter-thrust made it possible to build higher. Each advance in the technique of stained glass made it possible to open more of the wall to light, and each generation of builders pushed a little further than the last, not because they were in competition, but because the logic of what they were doing seemed to point in only one direction, upward, toward the light. O'Reilly reminds us that the men who built these cathedrals were not mystics or dreamers. They were practical craftsmen, with very precise technical knowledge. They knew exactly how to profile a rib so that it would carry load efficiently. They knew how to calculate the height of a flying buttress. They had learned through painful experience what happened when you got these calculations wrong, and they passed their knowledge through the guild system from master to apprentice, from father to son, from one generation of builders to the next. But they were also men who understood what they were making, could see that the structural logic of their art was producing something that had never existed before in human history. Buildings that seemed to be made of light, buildings in which the stone itself seemed almost to dematerialize, to become a skeleton of pure form through which the world outside could be seen in colors that no painter could mix on a panel. They were making the invisible visible. They were building prayers out of limestone and iron and sand, and the prayers are still standing 8 centuries later, still reaching upward, still full of light. As you rest now, as the night deepens around you and your breathing slows and the words of this old book settle into the quiet of your mind, let one image stay with you if you wish. It is the year 1145, early spring. In a small city in northern France called Chartres, the cathedral tower has just been completed, the one that still stands today and that O'Reilly calls the most beautiful tower in the world. The Bishop of Chartres, Geoffrey de Leves, comes out into the cathedral, close, and looks up at it, and the tower rises above him into a sky that is very blue and very cold, with the last thin light of the afternoon catching the upper courses of stone and turning them gold. And around him, in the square and in the streets leading to the cathedral, ordinary people, the merchants and the laundresses and the bakers and the farmers who have come market, all stop what they are doing and look up and are quiet for a moment, in the way that people are quiet when they are in the presence of something beautiful beyond their expectation, something that speaks to a part of them that has no words, only silence, and the particular kind of joy that is almost indistinguishable from sorrow, the joy of beauty, the joy of having been made capable of perceiving it, the joy of being alive in a world where such things exist and where other human beings, with nothing but stone and time and faith, built them for you, for all of us, for everyone who would ever stand in a cathedral and look up. Thank you for listening tonight to the Sleepy Archive. We will continue this journey through the cathedrals of France in the next chapter. But for now, let the stones rest, let the builders sleep, let the centuries settle into silence, and let yourself drift slowly, quietly, into the long and peaceful dark good night.